The ocean knows my name. The murky waters splashed violently against the shore. The wood of the damaged pier rolled and clattered in the waves that frothed on the sand. There were no cries of the seabirds, nor the warmth of the sun which had graciously lowered for its daily disappearance. The chill of the sea was one thing, but the call of his name was another. He could hear it. The almost too sweet, comforting lithe of a voice that was familiar, yet foreign. It called him to join her, with the sweetest cadence that softened his heart and fogged his mind, until the waves seemed like arms that stretched and beckoned him forward. His legs moved, carrying him perilously closer to her. Michael. Michael. She called in an unhurried tone that somehow stressed her need to have him close. Hang on, I'm coming. He reassured, with a small smile, feeling the coldness of the water that was now knee-high. You are a wonderful son to me. Those words, however, gave him pause. With widened eyes, he shook his head as his mind cleared, when he somehow woke to reality. An eerie splash nearby made him retreat with swiftness, back to the safety of the shore. For how could he be a wonderful son to a woman who had been dead for over 10 years?
The lighthouse. Everyone knew of Vernon's love for the sea. The old man's perfume was a strange combination of tobacco and the ocean. His respect to the unending mass of water was well known, for he would say, "The sea is as magnificent in the calm or the storm. In either case, best you respect her, for you never know if she would be your grave." Even after years of fishing a few miles from the shore, he had married himself to the old lighthouse by 8th Coast, east of the Plymouth town. Though his bones ached, he was married to be of use in the lighthouse, as a faithful watchman. He had seen so much, the movement of creatures far larger than whales, beneath his small fishing boat. To the chilling eyes of something with inhuman wit, that he swore cut through his nets numerous of times. Of course he tried to caution all who would listen, in the pub at the edge of town, loudly wailing his warnings to the young and old men, who were ignorant to the cruelty of the waters, about the watery graves that await them, if they ever heeded the call of the ocean witches. As he had heard the songs of the wicked beastly mermaids, trying to send him to a watery death. Nasty little things, he said they be. As one had even driven old Peter from the burrow, to jump off his ship from their lullaby madness. Vernon would frighten the children with his tales, even mentioning the mist that brought lights over the open waters. Many had chalked up his experiences to elaborate lies as ways to be more eccentric and mystical. Some even taunted him to catch footage of these strange sightings. But he was smart enough to never go exploring whenever he saw them. And his adamant hatred for technology, which he swore made people stupider by the generation, ensured that he never used a cell phone to capture these encounters. And besides, most of these unusual sightings happened when he was young, dumb and penniless. With age and reason, his one rule was to never be out at sea in the night. For he knew some things weren't worth his life, even at the expense of his reputation. For being curious and worried about others' opinions wasn't in his character, but bravery was. Everyone was aware of this, for he served in the army, and proudly reminded those in town, every chance he could, when visiting the diner for his favorite lemon pie. Happy as a clam one night, he sat with his feet propped up and folded over a table, as he puffed out manicure rings of ashy smoke. Seeing the flashing lights of an unfamiliar boat, signaling a distress call to the lighthouse, he swiftly lowered his pipe and scrunched his bushy brows over weathered ringed eyes. The wind and ocean was in a harmonious yet peaceful state. There was no sign of an oncoming storm brewing in any direction, for he would have felt it in his injured knee, long before it hit. There wasn't any immediate danger to the vessel, but still the flashing lights increased in urgency. Perhaps someone was injured upon the boat, meaning there was no time to dally, for every second counted. Rising to his feet, he rushed to the open door to phone the station, dialing quickly, hoping to employ some men to engage the ship that was too far out to distinguish, but close enough to see the lights of the lighthouse, as he waited while the phone ringed. Groaning from the fast movements that aggravated his creaky bones, he used his free hand to rub his throbbing back. Walking out, onto the small balcony, prepared to shout at Lieutenant Griff over the phone to send out some men. The old veteran peered out into the night as he waited, only to pause, suddenly gripping the spiral cord in disbelief, while he held the receiver loosely in the other hand. "Vernon, are you there? You never call, is something wrong?" Rubbing his eyes vigorously, he moved from by the door and walked back inside to glare through the glass front, clenching his callous hand on the hard plastic on the phone. The boat aggressively signaled its distress at those spots. But when he walked through the door again, to peer out, nothing greeted his eyes. There was no boat. No lights. Nothing. Only the crashing of the waves on the rocks below. Clearing his throat, he finally replied and made a half-excuse to his old pal, and made an impromptu plan to fish on Sunday, before hanging up the phone. And still through the glass, he frowned at the strangeness of what he was experiencing. During the entire time, the noticeable pulse from the ship winked at him, always becoming invisible, when he checked from the balcony, outside. The ship mocked the old veteran throughout the hours, only confusing old Vernon by the impossibility of what he was seeing. In the duration before dawn, Vernon pondered on the sanity of his mind, religiously smoking to keep from leaving his post of duty. Even as the boat continued to signal through the glass at the distant lighthouse, he did what his mama, bless her soul, said to do when Satan wanted to play tricks on God's children. He prayed. Prayed to the Lord who had saved his life on the battlefield, because of a praying mother. While his friends, precious souls that they were, had never lived long enough to return to their loved ones. Singing old hymns, he added a fresh batch of cannabis to his pipe and ignored the ghostly mirage. And, before the first embers of light could peek from the horizon, the ship vanished before his eyes. And then the slow climb of the sun into the sky brought brilliant shards of light piercing through the thinning darkness to herald a new day. Life was as uneventful as ever, after the years of old Vernon's experience. There was only the routine recounting of his glory days, as the town folk rolled their eyes and indulged in his stories they probably knew by heart. Even as his inner light dwindled, and his life came to a quiet end, Vernon never saw the ship again. And told no one of it. Yet years later, a trainee, a close relative to old Peter, a scraggly young man, would call the station 5 times throughout one year, notifying them of a ship that always disappeared, before help could arrive. Even the dead cannot rest. Of course Link had heard of the stories of the Biloxi Bay. Who hadn't? And yet after years of fishing on the pier, he hadn't heard or seen anything in all of the 5 years he'd frequented there. It was all just nonsense in his humble opinion, as this bay was always peaceful and mostly vacant. Which was the most enjoyable quality of the area, he surmised. In fact, it was so quiet that day, he had fallen asleep, as nothing took his bait. The sun had already dipped into the ocean, and the first winking stars were out to precede the night. Stretching with a yawn, he rose and pulled down his life jacket, before he began to organize his things to head home. Sniffling unconsciously, he froze when he heard an unfamiliar sound. Waiting. And waiting, the noise couldn't be heard again. The night remained silent, except for the explosion of the waves meeting the rocks nearby. Darkness crept over the sky, like an insidious wraith, covering all in its path. Grabbing his things with a bit more urgency, he stilled when he heard the unmistakable dragging of chains on the pier. As the eerie hum of the lights overhead came on, the spontaneous flicker startled him a bit. With an elevated heart rate and shallow breaths, Link turned. Terrified of what would greet him. Seeing nothing, he grabbed his cooler and outright deserted his new fishing rod, confident that it would be present when he returned, during the light of day. Making his way towards the parking lot, the uneasy tingle of awareness crawled like spider legs down his back. inflating the feel of fear in his heart and mind, to produce a staggeringly heavy mass of coal that burned in his stomach. Looking to the right, he blinked several times, staring in absolute shock. There, as clear as day, stood men and women, shackled by the ankle and wrist, being led onto a ship. Weary and haggard, they shuffled onto a 16th-century vessel with enormous sails. Clunk. The cooler fell from his hand, sending his drinks, ice and water, crashing onto the ground. A single beer rolled next to the feet of a man. One whose eyes were unfathomable tunnels of pain that reached across time and space. The utter hopelessness seemed to have suffocated any will to live or fight. For nothingness were within the male's eyes, one that threatened to suffocate Link within its depths. Swallowing, the old man abandoned everything and fled towards his car. Not ashamed one bit to be seen as a coward. Thunk, thunk, thunk. The sound of feet thumping against the aged wood and the dragging of chains followed him, while he huffed laboriously and ran to safety. Jumping into his car, he immediately locked himself in. Yet when he looked out from the safety of his vehicle, there was no one there. Not a soul on the pier. No ghost ship. No slaves. Just the dim lights lining the dock and pier, with the addition of his abandoned cooler, drinks and fish pole. Happy to leave immediately, Link left everything and drove away. He slowly began to relax when the ocean front disappeared altogether from the rear-viewing mirror. Although, he would periodically look behind him anxiously, fearful that somehow, the restless spirits would follow him. Months after, with the encouragement of his relatives, who he had shared the story with, he searched the name of the vessel he saw. What he found disturbed him into never fishing in that particular area again, for he finally listened to the tales told by others who had similar experiences. Understanding fully why the bay was sparsely visited, despite the wealth of fish present there. For he couldn't fault anyone for their wariness of the bay any longer. Years after, the very sight of a ship or chains would revamp his memory of the encounter. Even now, he couldn't forget the sorrow of the ghost's eyes, nor the historical tragedy of people being chained to a ship, while being the object of a storm's gruesome rage. To then be swallowed by the violent sea, knowing the most terrifying truth, that no one would rescue or care to wrestle the clutches of death for them. The seaweed. Everyone knew that James was a troubled, cast-aside child from the young age of 2. His mother had tried to sell him on multiple occasions for cocaine, while his father was an abusive alcoholic who thought he fooled everyone at church on Sundays. James wasn't nurtured or loved, so no one was particularly surprised when the news broke about his animal cruelty. People in the small town would wake to see their skinned dog or cat, gutted, hanging from their porch, or stuffed into a mailbox. And because of his new activity, he was rejected wherever he went. For who would look kindly upon a child who would hurt innocent animals? At school, he had speared a pen into another boy's ear, permanently damaging Mr. Bernard's son's eardrum. Fully and totally ostracized from that day forward, in the small town of 5,000, both children and mostly adults were wary of him, for they were certain that one day he would move on to taking human life. On a dull gray Saturday evening, after being chased from the bakery, he went to the small cove by the sea. Kicking rocks in boredom and diligently searching for crabs or anything on the shore to torment. He poked about with a stick, slipping several times on the mossy rocks, as a few crabs disappeared before he could spot them. Some time had passed, and he found nothing but unending stinky slimy seaweed that littered the rocks and sand haphazardly. Nothing presented itself to vent his frustrations upon. Disgusted, he sat upon a rock, shivering from the cold, refusing to leave and head home. For what waited for him there was nothing compared to the slight chill of the frigid cove. New bruises had already begun to take color on his skin, and the metallic taste in his mouth was vivid enough in his memory for stupidly moving a bottle of rum without permission. So he braved the cold, having nowhere to go, nothing to eat and no one to rely on. A bark startled him. Looking to the left while clutching his jacket close to his body, he rubbed his hands together to gather some warmth. James frowned when he saw something move. Not certain if it were a dog, he walked forward to investigate and quench his boredom. The bark came again. But a strange gagging sound followed. A little perturbed, he paused. The noise came again. However, it wasn't a bark but the sickly wheeze of something inhuman. Swallowing, James looked around in fear. Ready to flee, he stopped when the sound resonated all around him, on the foggy shore. Just 10 feet away, he swore he saw something move. The stench of rotten eggs soured the air, and burnt his nose. Squinting, he could make out the mass of something big, moving laboriously slow, towards him. Inch by inch it crawled. Wheezing, in that eerie sickly manner. James. It coughed out, in 2 syllables that caused his skin to break out, into severe goosebumps. The thing continued to move, laying low to the ground, but its eyes jolted him to the core. The chilling pale orbs of something otherworldly, remained fixated on him. And the urgent need to escape blared in his mind. Not much scared him, but this was downright terrifying. Turning to run, he made it only 2 feet, before he was stopped in his retreat. Long ribbons of seaweed wrapped themselves around his ankles, and pulled, until he fell flat on his stomach. Sand entered his mouth, as he screamed and screamed. "Somebody help me. Please anyone." But no one came, as he clawed at the sand in vain, while being dragged effortlessly into the depths of the sea, by the creature with the skin of seaweed. He had choked on the salty waters, while his eyes burnt and his lungs were flooded, before blackness enveloped him. James, however, was never seen again. He wasn't missed. Not by his father, or mother, who was always passed out in the Bolton alley. And certainly not by the victims of the pet owners and town folks who thought he was a nuisance. Weeks after, they found a hand that was identified by his father, upon seeing James' unmistakable yellow watch he always wore. His limb had been sawed in the very same manner of his animal victims. Which was a mystery in of itself, for no one would have gone to such extremes in the small town, for revenge. On the day of his funeral, not many attended. But those who did, ran off with haste, when they heard the terrifying wheezes coming from the casket, that only held 1 limb, from the missing James Broad.